Brilliant. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kayvan Azadi. I'm the head of Impact for Breakfast. Lovely of all of you to join us this morning to discuss this very important issue. I'm going to describe briefly a little bit of background on the IFB and talk about our four-part series and then hand it off to our panelists today. So Impact for Breakfast started about 18 years ago, just a handful of people. And since then, it has grown to 50 chapters and over 6,000 members around the planet. Some chapters are nascent, they're just getting started. Others have been around for a while and have over 1,000 members, 1,500, 1,600 members. The reason why we've grown so much is that all these needs are identified, needs as opportunities. And what we try to do is showcase some of these amazing needs and opportunities before some of the individuals that have the resources, connections to generate momentum around solutions, to generate a different outcome than where we are right now, what we're seeing right now. Plastics, being the core theme of this session, is exactly that type of topic. So we generated a four-part series that we launched a couple of weeks ago under the leadership of Hari and Joe, who are on the line. They'll join us as facilitators in a moment. And in that case, in that session, what we discussed was, again, the systemic case around plastics, all the components that we've built up around making this outcome our current reality. We're now realizing increasingly what the impacts of this particular outcome are, and we're trying to shift. We're trying to, through coordination and coordination of key investments, create a different reality for all of us and our planet. So today we're going to get into the why. We're understanding increasingly what the impacts of plastics are on human health and our environment. Daniel and Josh are going to discuss in detail some of the latest findings and what they endeavor to do at Silkwater Ventures. Coming up in session 3 on the 12th, so just in 10 days' time, we're going to showcase two companies leading the way on the transition from petroplastics to bioplastics and all of the supply chains that they are integrating their products into. Remarkable. And they're using seaweeds and sargassum in particular to generate these bioplastics. Session 4, which we will launch shortly, will bring all the pieces back around again and to really target in the key investments that are necessary and the other coordination that needs to take place. So I'm going to pause here and I'm going to hand it over to Hari to set the systemic case, and Joe is also going to. Hari, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Kayvan, and thanks everyone for joining. We had a fascinating discussion a couple of weeks ago to kick off the series, as Kayvan described, and we have 3 more sessions, including this one, to continue the conversation. So what I'll say in terms of a quick summary is that, the first session, Joseph and I started a conversation, and we had lots of engagement from the group around the need for systemic approaches to investing across value chains for systemic change. And I think the underlying thesis there is that we cannot address some of these material environmental problems or social problems or problems in general if we just focus on one aspect of the value chain or entity by entity without thinking about the system. So we had, the basis of that conversation at a high level. We talked about different pathways and the plastics case as a material execution case for a systemic solution. One of the points of feedback that I got from the group was that it was nice to see at a high level, but what does that mean in practice? And this session and the session that follows tells us a little bit more about elements within the value chains and across the system solution that we need to be thinking about in order to have a systemic lens as investors to approach these problems. So today we'll talk about microplastics in more detail. I'm very excited for Josh and Daniel to lead this conversation over the next little while. I will reiterate for those of you who weren't here in the first session that anything that I've led before in terms of moderating. But we are here at breakfast time in many parts of the world. For me, no meal is free, so expect to work. We'll call on people. We want participation. Nobody has the solution, and this is part of systems thinking as well. No one individual, one entity has the solution. We're all here because we believe this is a challenge. We're all here because we're intelligent, capable people that can execute. And I am here to learn from all of you, and I will be drawing upon as much as I possibly can to make the learning most effective. So with that, Joseph, if you want anything to add as a preamble, please do. Otherwise, we can turn directly to Josh and Daniel. Uh, Joseph, I'll give you. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, just very quickly, thanks so much. And yes, very much echoing Harry's sentiment that it is a question of bringing all the different stakeholders, not just in terms of people and ideas, but different perspectives along a value chain. So when looking at value chain transformation, as opposed to what first innings of impact investing many years had been, which is a collection of impactful Trojan ponies, that the system itself, perspectives from corporates, from investors, from off-takers, from regulators, and mainly from the science industry, which is where Dr. Karesnik's views are going to be very, very exciting to hear in terms of how that's shifting. But one thing that ties them all together that we're seeing to be able to shift that system is a financial narrative. What is the investment and financial narrative for each of those stakeholders? And would love everyone's perspective on sort of what moves the needle to get the different components to be mobilized because of a scalable financial narrative, and that there are different ones at different stakeholders to come in. So look forward to everyone's engagement and to a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Well, wonderful. So I'll turn over Josh, Daniel. The stage is yours.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. Delighted to be here with everybody. Sorry we're not actually around a table having breakfast together, but this is the next best thing. We'll be starting first with some general background that many of you are not novices to the field, but we'll go over things just to make sure we're all on the same page. So just briefly about myself, I'm a physician scientist at Harvard Medical School, Brigham and Women's Hospital. My focus of research is really on Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, as well as a liver complication called primary sclerosing cholangitis. And as part of my work, we're trying to understand how the environment influences these diseases. And we really thought in terms of food and other things like that, but really our exposures in our environment, which has altered so much, is becoming increasingly important in understanding these diseases. And microplastics has become more central to what some of our research projects are. As you're all well aware, this has become a topic that has been captured by the press, and people are increasingly concerned about it, as we'll go into more detail. The rise of plastic, as we're all aware, is really stunning. And starting in the 1950s, when the practical advantages of plastic became increasingly clear, it's really jumped hugely from just 2 million tons a year to 460, which is stunning and scary in itself. And even in just a very short period of time, it's more than doubled and projected to triple by 2060. Now, part of this is because there are real advantages to plastic in a practical sense, but it also, particularly single-use plastics that we're concerned about, is that every minute the equivalent of one garbage truck filled with plastic ends up in the ocean. And as you know, plastic has been found everywhere from rainwater to the air we breathe to the deepest parts of the ocean and the highest parts of our environment. So just to be clear, to start off in terms of what are MNPs, or micro and nanoplastics, we're talking about microplastics. These are plastics that are smaller than 5 millimeters. And it's also a whole variety of plastics. So we're not talking about a single entity. These have different health effects as well, and that needs to be detailed in further studies. Nanoplastics is under 1 micrometer, and just to give you a reference, a red blood cell is 6 to 8 micrometers. So we're talking about tiny particles that can get into our bodies and do a whole host of things. I think that for many years it's assumed they're sort of inert, they don't do anything, but the real question is, what are the health impacts? Daniel and Alexander will be talking more about some of the other implications, but I'll focus in on health impacts, and particularly I'll take four case scenarios to give a little bit more detail. The medical world has been slow to wake up to this, and now it's sort of more than awake and really racing forward. So you can see here, it really is only in about 2010 that the first articles started appearing, and now it's a major area. Lots of the methodologies still need to be worked out, and so there's still some controversies about how to measure and how to identify appropriately what are microplastics. And most importantly, it's not just microplastics in themselves, but they act as sponges and bring many other things along. And so that's part of what this research involves. When we think in terms of the annual social costs, this was an interesting study done recently as a multidisciplinary effort at Duke, is we certainly are concerned about the environment and the profound effect that microplastics have. But when we look more broadly and look at across a whole host of areas, this estimate came up is that the cost available to date, the cost on health effects of plastic, are an order of magnitude higher than all other cost estimates, on the order of several $100 billion. Now, you can see that the margins here, the ranges here are huge. So the estimate in terms of loss of the marine ecosystem services are 1.4 to 112 billion. So that enormity of a range tells us that we need to learn much more about what the specific effects are. And these estimates need to be taken in that perspective, that we need to understand much better what's happening. But it certainly highlights the fact that we're just beginning to get a sense of the impact on human health, and it's enormous. When we look in the body, everywhere in the human body, microplastics are found. So we're riddled with microplastics. We'll talk a little bit about the brain. We would think that the brain is protected by the blood-brain barrier, but they can cross the blood-brain barrier and leading to serious neurologic risks. And the studies have been good and growing there in the lungs. It's been linked to respiratory diseases, including asthma, in the liver and the kidneys, where they serve to detoxify and function in that role in the body. They've been found there and may be impairing this. Some of the best done studies are really looking in the blood and blood vessels and the impact on cardiovascular health. In the gut, something that I'm particularly focused in on, this causes both a dysbiosis, so an alteration of the gut microbiome, which is of great central interest. And microplastics, even if they're not absorbed into our bodies, alters the microbiome, both microplastics in themselves, as well as the other things they carry with them, and even in terms of reproductive organs. So these do act as endocrine disruptors in terms of what they bring along with them. They've been found in testicles, in other hormonal disrupting capacities, impacting sperm count and other health effects that we'll talk about slightly. So what happens when nanoplastics invade a cell? And these are tiny. And microplastics, unlike other biologic products, can't be broken down by a cell. It's a novel thing for the body in the millions of years that it took to evolve. We don't have the capacity to break these down. So when something like this gets into the cell uses its repertoire of responses to try to break them down. One of these is generation of reactive oxygen species, or free radicals, and other pro-inflammatory proteins, thinking we know how to handle this. This is a foreign protein. We're going to get rid of this, but it can't. And so for some of the diseases that I study, as well as other diseases, these are taken up by various cells like macrophages and other cells, and they it really causes a cycle of inflammation. It causes cell injury, cell death in some cases, reduced cell viability, and reduced cell proliferation. So the body's capacity to repair itself is impaired as well. And this is a cycle which persists. This then impacts each organ that it goes into. In the brain, there was this study that some of you no doubt are aware of, that autopsies in early 2024 found more plastic particles in the brain than samples from only 8 years earlier. Plastic levels in the brain increased by 50% over that 8-year period. And particularly alarmingly, there was a greater accumulation of microplastics observed in the cohort of brains from people with documented dementia. There may be a variety of ways of explaining this, and this is not causality, but an association, but an alarming association in any event. Microplastics, as I mentioned, bring with them a host of things. Phthalates is one area of concern. It's been banned often in Europe and in California, but not across the United States. Microplastics can carry phthalates and other endocrine disrupting chemicals. In an important study that was done in rats, using both micro nanoplastics and phthalates in rats, the findings mirror what we see in the human disease of polycystic ovarian syndrome, like patterns, a pro-inflammatory effect and endocrine disruption. And this kind of data is much more persuasive than just sort of an association. This suggests more of a direct causality. Obviously, this isn't in humans, but it is, and it's not the only reason why this disease would be initiated and developed and persist, but it may be one important factor. The role of microplastics as carcinogens is an area which is just being researched more. I'd say the link so far is weaker than some of these other areas, but it suggests a possible link. One issue is whether there's just a pro-inflammatory effect, as mentioned, and inflammation, chronic inflammation anywhere in the body leads to an increased risk of cancer. One area of particular of concern is that the age of onset of colon cancer is getting at a younger age. So it used to be we would start screening with colonoscopies at age 50. Now we start at age 45. The reasons for that are not clear, but there's some data that suggests microplastics may be a driver for early onset colorectal cancer. It may be important in inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis that I research, and that may promote the inflammatory disease, which then promotes the risk of colorectal cancer. And other data suggests that breast cancer, it could be a cofactor to increasing the risk as well. I'd say the best done study that suggests a worrisome connection is in this study that was in the New England Journal of Medicine. It looked at 312 patients undergoing carotid endarterectomy. So carotid endarterectomy, the vessel in your neck, can get blocked, and that can lead to problems. So people are screened for that with certain types of symptoms, and then there's a procedure to take out that plaque, the arterial plaque that develops. That plaque was taken out, it was examined for microplastics, and it was assessed for both the presence of micro nanoplastics and then the risk of heart attack, stroke, and death subsequently was looked at. And polyethylene was detected in over half of patients, and those with polyethylene had a 4.5 times higher risk of MI, stroke, or death over 34 months. So this was extremely well done, methodologically appropriate, and again, it's not directly causality, but a strong suggestion of that. There's also evidence that microplastics in the body is continuing to increase with exposure. uh, in a University of Hawaii study found that over a 15-year period, the proportion of human placentas containing microplastics increased dramatically. So 60% 2006, 90% 2013, and essentially 100% by 2021. And the number of microplastic particles per placenta increased significantly over time. So certainly starting out life at that point is concerning, and microplastics can get out of the body, but they really persist in the body for long periods of time. Infants who are exposed, whether through plastic baby bottles or other sources, may carry these particles throughout much of their lives. When you're heating up formula for a baby, that helps leach out some of the microplastics even more. And so a particular concern and something that needs to be addressed urgently. So what can we do about it? There are many things that I think we can do about it. I think from my perspective, we certainly need more and better quality research within the research area. We really need to understand better standards for how to measure microplastics and agree on some of the better quality. Now, much of the research we do requires sort of pyrolysis or burning the tissue to see what microplastics are there. We're now in the area of developing other techniques where that isn't required, and we'll get a better sense of that. We need to understand the different types of microplastic and how they can impact things separately. I think there are many things that we can do as individuals to take practical steps to limit our exposure, and hopefully that will influence the marketplace, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And as this group is very well aware, we really need broader systemic change. It's not just a matter of what we're doing as individuals, but how do we create an environment where this is being driven, whether it's by regulatory issues or by the marketplace. The European Union is ahead of the US, and they've added microplastics that are now restricted with a phased transition report period and new reporting requirements beginning this year. And additional packaging rules are taking effect in August of this year. But having said that, these regulations are pretty mild. These are not sort of wholesale changes of forcing changes in single use. It's really around the edges, and we can talk about that in more detail. The U.S. landscape, as you know, is more fragmented. It's intensifying. It's more on the state level. At the federal level, the picture is really mixed with some elements within the current administration pushing for this and others pushing for really deregulation more broadly. So when we think about how to protect ourselves, we think that there are at least three central routes: ingestion, so eating it, taking it in through food or other things, inhalation, and skin contact. And so the bottled beverages, as we'll talk about more, we think is sort of the leading edge where it may be, some people have suggested, and plausibly, that this may be the largest source of exposure. We'll talk more about alternatives for this and some of the problems there. Tap water, there's some likely less, but that needs to be filtered, and tap water is not as clean as we would like, but drinking from genuinely stainless steel, not single-use plastic cans, as we'll hear more about. Hot beverages are probably some of the greatest sources as well. So if you get a cup of hot coffee in a paper cup, it's not just paper, but it's lined with plastic. And that hot water brings out that plastic into your beverage even more. If you're using a plastic tea bag, that releases billions of microplastics into your tea. And so whether it's loose leaf tea in a tea ball or paper tea bags, that's critical as well. Avoiding plastic utensils when cooking and when eating. I think increasingly people are using containers of glass or metal, and it's critical not to heat food in plastic containers, microwave or other ways, which will just sort of pour microplastics into your food. And this gets to be a little bit more difficult, but choosing fresh and unpackaged food or avoiding plastic wrapped or processed items when possible that come in plastic packaging. So these are fairly simple, straightforward things. I think that addressing some of the supply chain issues of how to really change this is critical and critical to what we're talking about today. In terms of air, there's a remarkable amount of plastic still there, and not to make everyone paranoid. I think in studying some of these areas, you start worrying about everything you do. But there are HEPA filters with clean and natural ingredients that can avoid or at least reduce some of the microplastics in the air. And sort of avoiding some of the plastic heavy cleaning supplies also can be beneficial as a way of reducing your exposure. A lot of personal care products have nano plastics in them. There are some that Daniel will be talking about that are trying to move away from that. And laundry is an enormous source of shedding microplastics. About 2/3 of our clothes are made from different types of plastics. And laundry is an opportunity for that to shed and also an opportunity to reduce the environmental exposure. And Daniel will talk about some products there as well.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Yeah, so now that we've taken a dive into the science and some of the health implications, let's look at how the public and companies are responding and what trends we're beginning to see in the market. So as we discussed, public awareness and discourse around this issue is really continuing to grow. And just like in the scientific community, the conversation in the media has really taken off, in many ways mirroring the growing public concern, especially over just the last couple of years. You saw this graphic before, but I think it's worth highlighting again that these headlines are everywhere, including across major news outlets. And it's not just reporting on the latest studies. There's been a huge surge in practical guides, in consumer pieces, in sort of lifestyle and health and food magazines like Men's Health and Food and Wine, with articles focused on, really sort of how people can practically take steps in their daily lives to reduce their exposure. Importantly, the conversation is also surging on social media and in new media outlets as well. Folks like Mark Hyman and Andrew Huberman amplifying this topic and really helping to bring it beyond just academic journals and sort of firmly into public consciousness. And all of this is, really beginning to shape consumer awareness and concern. According to some of the most recent survey data from 2025 in the US, 90% of US adults are concerned about the health implications of microplastics. And when it comes to drinking water in particular, again, here, a majority of Americans are quite concerned about microplastics as the primary contaminant in their drinking water. And the same trends hold true across Europe and in other regions around the world. So how are companies responding to this shift in sentiment? Well, we're beginning to see some firms either sort of build businesses altogether or just sort of create more marketing, sort of centrally focused on these issues as key selling points. So, more reduced plastic and plastic-free positioning as key selling points. And just to highlight a few, Jolie is a company that's built a really strong brand focused on removing chlorine, heavy metals, and other contaminants from shower water. More Peas is a company that sells baby feeding products that are entirely plastic-free. Cleaner, taking on the issue more from an environmental angle, is tackling one of the largest sources of microplastic pollution, which is laundry, and it basically has a device that will remove plastic microfibers from clothing that shed from clothing before they make it into our waterways. Blue Land, another great company in this space. They create safer household, cleaning products, and have also built a very successful brand around reducing single-use plastic, using dissolvable tablets and other reusable systems. And since they were created in 2019, have more than $300 million in lifetime sales, and are continuing to grow. So what we're seeing from these, brands and many others is the same sort of underlying pattern. Companies are identifying overlooked everyday sources of exposure and turning them into opportunities for innovation, opportunities for trust building with consumers, and really, meeting the public where it is and where it will definitely be as well in the coming years. And I think one other, example that I just want to highlight, which, serves as further evidence of this transition, is in the bottled water market, an enormous market. And there are a number of companies, including these two on the screen, that have been quite successful, have, within the US at least, have, very wide national distribution, and have really leaned into the anti-plastic messaging, which is now, embedded into their core identity. More ocean, less plastic, hashtag get the plastic. And, just more signals of how these themes are increasingly resonant with consumers. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who's also part of our team, who is able to join for today's call. So Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Daniel. Glad to be able to be here with all of you. Next slide would be great. So, look, plastics are everywhere. They do great things for our lives. They're not disappearing overnight. But where we have concrete, practical opportunities, steps we can take to reduce our exposure, we absolutely should, especially in light of the emerging health picture that Josh outlined. So if we're looking for places to start, the low-hanging fruit, bottled beverages are very likely the single largest source of exposure. And within that, bottled water, both in substance and public imagination, is really the tip of the spear. A study from 2024 by researchers at Columbia University found that a liter of bottled water contains, on average, approximately 240,000 detectable plastic fragments, essentially consuming a microplastic smoothie. And bottled water is a massive category. It's the single largest beverage category in the US, larger than all soda, larger than all alcohol, $50 billion market and growing every year. And water is also the base of all other beverages. So if we can crack the code on the problem here, that can be expanded more broadly. Notably, many of the offerings that might seem to be safe alternatives aren't. So all aluminum beverage cans, single-use beverage cans, are lined with plastic, every single one. So the actual material in contact with liquid is plastic. I think many folks reach for aluminum cans thinking they're a safer alternative, but it's still a plastic-based drinking experience from a health perspective. Moreover, glass, while glass itself is an inert and very safe material, the caps on glass bottles are a source of serious concern. Both the paint on caps, research has shown, can chip off and end up in the liquid. And more than that, the caps have plastic liners on the inside, which is needed to create a hermetic seal. And there's peer-reviewed research showing as the cap is twisted on and off, it's like a pepper grinder. And it sprays microplastics into the liquid, often in greater quantity than may come off the wall of a plastic bottle. In fact, there was a study out of France last year finding that many glass bottles have higher concentrations of microplastics than plastic bottles, and it's because of these mechanisms. So all of this is to say nothing on the market today can credibly claim to be microplastic free. And this is a gap. It's also an opportunity. And we're going to need a universe of solutions, but this is where we're taking concrete steps to be part of the solution. So our team is launching Aluvo Water, and focused on the advancements in filtration and packaging. Those are really the two components for the whole beverage category. On advancements in filtration and packaging that can really seriously remove microplastics from the consuming environment. So we're using really rigorous filtration techniques, more common in the medical world, porting them over to this context. Part of what's needed is just like a real end-to-end diligence about making sure the filtration process is contaminant free, making sure all the piping is metal, that there aren't places where the disinfectant chemicals used to clean facilities aren't reintroducing contaminants. It's about being rigorous end to end. And then on packaging, we're first launching in glass with an alternative cap, solving for that cap issue. Moreover, we are working on a next gen packaging approach, replacing the traditional plastic liner in cans with an alternative. And we're particularly excited about that as an opportunity to be adopted more, something that can be adopted more broadly by the beverage market and really make a difference at scale. So I think zooming out, yes, the problem of microplastics is daunting, but it's also actionable, right? On a certain level, this isn't rocket science. There are steps we can take. It's not a panacea, simple one-step solution, but there's steps we can take that will meaningfully reduce our exposure and can ripple outwards in terms of having broader health effects for the better. The other thing about this issue, perhaps distinguished from other elements of the plastics conversation, is that there's a very strong and compelling health story, right? Where the ask here isn't for consumers to sacrifice on behalf of a lofty goal that may be out of sight, out of mind. There's a raw self-interest case to make that we think is going to help accelerate the transition away from plastics. All of this means that we do not need to wait for government action and regulation. Certainly, that will help put wind in the sails and move things forward. But the natural consumer demand, particularly as the media conversation on this topic accelerates, we think is going to be an important and powerful accelerant of change in the marketplace. So just to share, Daniel, next slide, a taste of how this is really bursting into the center of the town square. Netflix in a few weeks is releasing a major documentary on this topic. All part of the growing volume and velocity of conversation on this issue. So I think we will wrap our presentation there and look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much. So look, I've got a ton of questions. I'm sure the audience here has a bunch as well. I'm going to kick us off though, if you don't mind. So we heard, Josh, from you some of the research broadly, but more specifically on the health side. And then Daniel and Alex, we heard a little bit on the solution side and kind of pathways forward. If I may take the liberty as a co-moderator, I'm going to ask a couple of questions kind of across that spectrum and to kick us off. So, Josh, not to be so general and say what is the future of research looking like in microplastics, I have two very specific research questions as it relates to the presentation we just heard. So one is that we often hear the argument for plastics and the reason for the rise of plastics as being because it's so good for so many things. And there's a large kind of positive health argument from the plastics industry around the rise of plastics and the need for plastics in the market. So I'm curious, with all of this health implications on the microplastic side, has there been or is there a future wherein we can look at kind of the overall landscape of the positive side of plastics in the medical industry and the negative side of microplastics in the health industry and do sort of a cost benefit across the board to kind of look at the net? So that's one. And hold on for 1 second.
Yeah.
The second is that if microplastics are such a severe problem, and that's based on the existing formulation of plastics in the marketplace, and all the reasons that you said in air and water and food and all these places, as we look forward to the next session that we're going to have here in terms of replacing the inputs in the plastics industry, if we move into bioplastics or other formulations, do we get around the microplastics issue? Or is there enough research done on that? Or is there a future in which we will understand that the bioplastics residual impacts are much the same from a molecular perspective? So can you speak to us about both of those things, the net kind of health implications of plastics today and the arguments there versus plastics tomorrow and the health implications? And then two, uh, if there's a plastics future, is the formulation a way that we can address it, or is it a reduction in plastic across the board that's necessary in order to reduce the health implication and the economics around that?
Those are critical questions and really, really helpful for framing it. I'd say that the net balance depends on sort of the second part of it, meaning, are we just stuck with these things? We need to make that calculation. So if you look at something like intravenous lines, is there an alternative? Right now, we don't really have a good alternative, but we do worry that is that an enormous source of exposure. So when we're doing some of these studies, even if, say, someone has Crohn's disease and they're getting an intravenous medication, or they have cancer and they're getting an intravenous medication, is that sort of because of the treatment that we're doing this, but then is the treatment producing more of a problem in itself? So I don't think we're stuck with these things. So it's not as if it's a calculus we need to make unless we have alternatives. And when we look at the alternatives, which are really nascent, they're not very well established by any means. So in the very short run, when we don't have a better scientific base, even when you look at something like smoking, which is as well researched as anything, the research was really difficult and still difficult to feel convinced about all the different health effects. So when you look at plastic, where we're just beginning to get this together, it's a much earlier stage. The question is, though, there's enough data there to force changes in the field to say, yeah, we don't need to say, yeah, there's a cost benefit analysis here. It's worth it because we don't know yet. We know that there's some hazard here, and we know we want to develop something better. The challenge there is the bioplastics. So there are different types of bioplastics, certainly. When you look at many of the bioplastics that have been not well researched yet, the health effects so far in animal studies and other cellular things seem to be have the same problems, or in some studies even worse. If you're looking at other types, say seaweed may be slightly better. If you're looking at something like Sargasso seaweed, it's an interesting problem in itself because, as you may know, there are these blooms of Sargasso seaweed that are causing all sorts of health effects on the Florida coast and the Caribbean. I think it offers an incredible opportunity for other types of interventions, but also one way of trying to deal with that is, can we create a way of getting rid of that? That may be better. Other types of seaweed are not so good. So some of the seaweed, not most, but some seaweed has carrageenan in it. Carrageenan we use for thickeners, say McDonald's milkshakes and other food has carrageenan. There's some data implicating its hazard in a whole host of diseases, particularly ulcerative colitis, though somewhat controversial. So I think bioplastics will hopefully get to the point where they're safer for health. I think they may be better for the environment, but most bioplastics so far, outside of the seaweed, don't look like so far they're better for human health. They may be better for the environment. So we're hopefully in a transition period. Right now, we don't have a lot of alternatives for many of the exposures in the health field. So we're saying, yeah, we want single-use things because of sterility and being able to toss out some of these things and not trying to recirculate. But people are trying very much to create alternatives. We just don't have them yet. And I think we need to be more creative in what we're doing.
Fantastic. So thanks very much for that. And a great unintended preview of the third session, talking about sargassum as an input flow into bioplastics. So appreciate that as well as we look forward into this series. So suffice to say, we're early days in the research, but these are two avenues that are really important for researchers to consider as we move the research agenda forward. Fantastic. Joseph, I saw you come off mute, and I have a couple of parlays I wanted to do into the crowd here as well, because I know there's lots of good feedback.
Absolutely, and just kind of from a European perspective, it'd be great to get a US input in terms of the changes in regulatory landscape that you're seeing or optimistic on, that might be levers that accelerate the motivation for the mainstream corporates to change their capex and real systemic transition. We spoke on the first session on CBAM being a trigger for the operating model and cost structures in Europe. I hope there's views on the evolution of such American tariffs, but in terms of the health and other regulatory constraints that might be more nuanced, it'd be great to get your perspective on what the policymaking landscape looks like that might have on the horizon some significant changes.
Josh, do you want to go first on that?
Well, go ahead. I think you can handle that one.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, so I think given this is such a new issue, there's not yet been in the U.S. context, a significant government response yet. I think what's notable is there are clear signs of bipartisan interest in this topic. RFK Jr. in his first speech when he joined the government spoke about microplastics in particular as one of the topics he wanted to take on. It's become part of the broader MAHA movement in the U.S. So it seems to be an issue, maybe in contrast to traditional environmentally framed issues, that has shows early signs of bipartisan buy-in. At the same time, this is not necessarily regulation forward administration, and government in the U.S. tends to move slowly, ultimately, in addressing new contaminants, that kind of thing. I think, though, if we look at something like PFAS as perhaps an analog, now we're seeing real action, both regulatory and on the industry side, to remove, to address PFAS in the product supply. But that took many years. I mean, over a decade to reach this moment. It began with an initial research picture on a topic that otherwise wasn't really on people's radars, and then built up over time. So I think it's not going to be instant, but I think we are going to arrive at a place where the crescendo here continues to build, and there will be policy making.
I think just to add that, as many of you are probably much more aware than I am, it's not, though, a one-sided equation of pushing towards improvement in regulation. The petrochemical industry is under threat because of the changes to whether it's electric cars or reduction in peak uses of oil. And so they see plastics as a great source of growth and revenue. And so that's a concern, and they're hiring some of the same lobbyists that were used for tobacco and other things to push against this. So it's not sort of a straightforward path. Once we get a new administration in, then there'll be more regulation in this area. It will be a contentious area for a long time.
Yes, no, that's the petrochem motivation is certainly the one upstream to tackle, and the way we're seeing it in Europe is CBAM and changing the pricing mechanisms that makes those operating margins very different and forces a transition. It'd be great to see if the US is also having more thoughts on sort of like the price-related motivations as opposed to just the restrictions from PFAS or other that may influence the embedded carbon price of plastic.
Yeah. Well, just quickly on that topic, I mean, the CBAM is one of the environmental policy areas. For those who haven't been following it necessarily, CBAM is carbon price levied at the border. It's a way for countries to have decarbonization impact beyond their own shores. And in the US, there actually has been some bipartisan interest in the tool, certainly nascent, but Senators Graham and Cassidy, two Republicans of Louisiana and South Carolina and Louisiana, respectively, introduced a Foreign Pollution Fee Act, which is would be the U.S. joining CBAM essentially and levying its own carbon fee at the border. There was also a bill called the Prove It Act, which just passed with bipartisan support, sort of measuring U.S. Carbon intensity of goods as a tee up to a broader global carbon price. So more to come, but early signs of potential traction and interest, which we're then pricing in the carbon content, including of plastics, could have broader market impact.
Very exciting.
That's fantastic.
If I may, just one last question in terms of the Ulva water and the work you guys are doing. It's phenomenal sort of progress. And thanks so much for sharing those solutions. But what challenges are you facing in scaling that up, and how would you what would help? How can the community or anyone on the line or elsewhere help? And what are the next steps that would support that scale up?
Daniel, do you want to handle that? Or I'll say that we're at an early stage, so we're getting our first product out this year. And so, we're in the process of raising capital. I think it's generic to an early stage startup. There's tremendous interest, I would say, and we're looking certainly for partners to help scale this up. So we're at an early stage. We're about to go into production, and looking for partners. So thank you.
May I jump in with a question?
Please.
An investor perspective question. Just looking from an investor perspective, I think those who are compelled to define mission and what they do, they want to be able to understand what a heat map looks like of this issue and look at it from a kind of value chain perspective. And if you were to look at it like trying to find the best market white space, where should investors be looking? Is it about an alternative material or product that's about to start production? Is it looking at prevention? Is it looking at filtration technologies? Is it looking at testing and verification technologies? Like, where along the chain is the hottest point of the heat map? Where should the interventions begin? And if investors are going to come in, we all know from investment experience that you might just be pressing on one little point, thinking this product is going to be the game changer. It frequently is part of a much more complex system. So if you want to gather a consortium of investors, a community of practice, ideally you're touching on various points simultaneously with others. I would love to hear your thoughts, your guidance on what other elements on this heat map are really critical for investors that are prospective to get involved. How do they look at this? And then where do they come to? Like, do they talk to you guys? Is it another series of sessions looking at kind of a spectrum of interventions?
I think that the consumer sentiment is growing, and I think that you're absolutely right. When we were confronting these issues, it's a question of where do we put our flag down, and we looked at a variety of areas to try to develop products first, whether it's personal care products or other things. But we think that one is because it's an enormous market, and because we hope to be successful in itself, we also hope that we can be a model for a successful product. I think some of the issues like filtration are there. It's a mature enough sort of system that we know what works. We've sort of had to assemble different filtration technologies together in a unique way, but I think that exists. I think that the testing issue needs to grow and needs to have faster turnaround time, but that's that is growing in sophistication and is there, and that will meet the market needs, but it's already largely there. I think it's sort of scaling up two things recognizing where plastics are coming from, which product to get into. I do think, it is a broader ecosystem. And so that I think there's any number of places that someone can start with. We started with this because it's such an enormous source of exposure, because many of the components, I think, are mature. We know glass is safe. The innovation is small. We think it leads to a much broader innovation of the novel lining of cans. But there are lots of other areas that people can get into, even whether it's takeout food, whether it's paper cups and liners. We're looking at all these things of using an alternative liner to be innovative to sort of drive this. And I don't know whether Daniel or Alexander, you want to add something to that?
No, I think it's a good summary. I think this is such a new topic in terms of how it's exploded onto the scene. The contours of it are still coming into focus. There is certainly a question mark. This is something we've heard a few times about the extent to which microplastic free as a selling point can be the sort of the central way we're meeting consumers, or is it a broader just sort of health and purity message? We've seen glass as a material, aluminum as a material grow in popularity. There's still some understanding of what's driving that. There is a consumer education component where I think people reach for cans or other things thinking they're safe. Certainly there are brands that gesture at that, right? Liquid Death uses the hashtag, as Daniel spoke about, death to plastic, while serving its beverage in a plastic lined can. So there's some misunderstandings. I think the industry is taking advantage of those misunderstandings at the moment, but that will change with time.
And I think even though we here are all sort of understand the problem and the needed message, as Alexander's pointing out, I think we see one of our key missions is really education and getting that word out and understanding the subtleties of it, which needs to be done in a very simple and direct way, because that's critical. And most people either feel like, yeah, there's something we've heard about it, it's something we care about, but the depth of the concern is less there. And we also recognize that our initial product is sort of a high-end product. We want to eventually get to something that can reach people on a much broader scale.
If I may, I think this is great. A great conversation that links back up to the higher level of the four-part series here, right? Which is a systems view. So one of the things I really appreciate about this conversation, your question, Audrey, the responses, Josh, Alexander, Daniel, is that one, we're seeing this from the perspective of sound research on the health side, research more broadly, the investor lens. Alex, you brought sort of the policy lens from North America and Europe, and we have the kind of entrepreneurial lens as well. I really like this theme, and we see this a lot in systems approaches. This theme that you're not focused on the customer first and then product and then building the business backwards. I think the response to your question, Audrey, is really, really interesting in that they're thinking about the system first and then seeing what levers can be pulled sort of most immediately based on some criteria. And this pathway on the product side is an initial product to address a systemic issue. The other part of a systems lens, I think, to draw a connection to is, and I just realized this as you were speaking, Alex, that we were on a panel together 9 months ago. But also, even within one of these realms where there's research, science, investment, policy. On the policy side, Alex and I were on a bipartisan panel looking at the bipartisan support for nature and climate solutions. And I think sometimes, Josh, even in your response to Alex, I heard you say something around a change in administration. But I think we also need to think about the systemic solutions within the policy constructs that we have and how we can drive, common understanding. So the research and awareness raising, simple messaging side, the common investment thesis is bipartisan. and common health outcomes and common outcomes for our children and families is bipartisan as well. So we don't have to wait. I think there are a lot of things that we can do together. And this was the theme that came out of our discussion last summer, Alex. There's a lot of things that we can do, even if we think about policy from a bipartisan and a systemic view that we can advance immediately today, and everyone's going to be on board and interested by. This relates also, Chiara, to your question below regarding the hope gap. I think it's difficult if we just focus in narrow areas on, aluminum is better than plastic, and send that as the simple message to consumers when it's not the case. And we just saw some examples around why it's not the case. And to draw in some of the other folks here, one of the things we were hearing in the presentation earlier was the direct contribution of microplastics into our systems. Declan, I wanted to turn to you for a second, and the work that you're doing in terms of the secondary contribution of industries relating to a majority of the microplastics problem. Just paint the picture a little bit so we can understand beyond just kind of direct consumption in air, water, and materials, where you're focused to paint the picture more broadly. Because while, Josh, you mentioned people on this call are aware of the system, we're still unaware of portions of it that are going to inform our collective action towards solutions at a systemic level. So Declan, I'd love to hear about the secondary contributions to microplastics from your perspective. And then we have a bit of time for a few more questions, and Keyvan will stop us when we don't have any time left.
Sure, Harry. I think the piece that we deal with and work in is the piece that's out of sight and out of mind, which are the secondary microplastics. And if you listen to people like Winnie Lau in Pew Trusts, who would say that 1/3 of all microplastics come from these secondary microplastics, you very quickly come to realize that, in fact, it's tires, paint, and textiles that create the lion's share of the microplastics in that space. Now, clearly, the task is to stop them at source. Now, it's no coincidence that each of these industries are oligopolies, which are classically the worst industries in terms of change driven by the industry itself, and the most important where regulatory changes or regulatory signaling is important. I think we don't need to sit there and wait for the silver bullet on the regulatory side. I think what's necessary is the signaling of regulatory change. And I took some hope from the use in the recent UN plastics negotiations, and you have to look hard to find hope, but there is hope where I think the message is very clear. This is now a public health risk. People start using language like this is like tobacco, and that's the sort of language which will drive political interest, public interest, which will drive political interest, which will drive regulatory change. So I think, and most importantly, these need to be stopped at source. Obviously, if we can clean up after the event in water treatment plants, that's great. But I think that we must be looking at solutions that are stopping these microplastics at source, whether it's filters on washing machines, different kinds of paints, different kinds of maintenance methods that stop the paint ending up in the environment. Clearly, tires is a design issue. So I think a lot of work can be done, but I think these sort of discussions are super important, raising the profile of the issue. And I think there are opportunities. I think I can see in Europe there is a trend. Obviously they picked pellets because there's nobody out there fighting for the right to dump pellets into the environment, but they haven't touched paint, tires, or textiles yet.
Yeah, if I could ask something. On the last session, Joe, I asked you, why is now the time? Why is there the convergence of several different things that make this the point in time where we address this issue? I'd like to ask the same question of the panelists because each bring very different perspectives. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just the surge in interest, both in the scientific community that's also being met by the public, is what makes now a compelling time to act. It's just, we've been tracking it closely, of course, as we work on this, but just the surge of media attention around this on social media, things going viral. There's just so much attention being paid to this issue. And I think, as Declan was just talking about, a real great opportunity to pair some of the environmental messaging with the public health message, which often gets a lot of eyeballs and may move us closer to real sort of policy action on a shorter timeline. So, I think we really now are at this critical time where our understanding is just becoming good enough. Of course, a lot more research is on the way, but there's really, it's clear there's a problem. the public is becoming increasingly aware of that, and a lot of opportunity to push industry and those in government.
And I would just add that as Hari was pointing out, it's not just a matter of waiting for the next administration. That may happen or it may not. And even if it does, getting regulations in place is going to be a long time. So I think one of the key drivers has to be innovation in industry and the marketplace and harnessing the patient's desire and interest with scientific innovation. And that's maybe going to be the key driver that lets the rest move forward.
If I may just jump in and complement that, in terms of the why now, apart from sort of the policy trigger, it's also the culmination of various influences, whether it's policy, carbon pricing, healthcare, consumer trends, whereby strategy at every single company cannot just afford to do things incrementally. At some point, they're going to get there, whether it's McKinsey or others, or they just figure out their strategy of thinking, actually, we need to do something. And the issue when it relates to CapEx or what it is they do, that's not just incremental. It's a business risk to do something that's dramatically different to the rest of your ecosystem, whether it's your competitors or whether it's your stakeholders along the value chain. And an important part that's missing that's missed about the discussion with the Global Plastics Treaty is that at the negotiating table, it's not just 300 countries or 250 countries. It's one party is a coalition of 280 multinationals, the Business Coalition for the Plastics Treaty. I just put a link in the chat to one of the articles on their site. Their motivation is not there to lobby against. Their massive motivation is to get the treaty done, because they're like, we all know we need to do something. We just need harmonization. Can you guys please figure out what is the harmonization we need so that we can all get on with our business and put our CapEx in the right area? Because otherwise they're all in limbo, and that's bad for business for everybody. So in terms of the why now conversation, it's not just the regulatory trigger or any of the other levers on their own. It's just business as usual has to have scalability in what they do and harmonization to get on with it. And that's what they're all asking for.
Just adding one element of complement there. I think there's another factor that's coming in. I think the private sector is understanding a need to shift. I think this harmonization leads also to the idea of consolidated views on kind of pulling the value chain along from the buy side. So we're having a lot more conversations recently around buyers clubs, around sustainable solutions through the value chain. And I think one of the key things for any of these systemic transitions is we often talk at the investor side or the corporate side around FOMO, fear of missing out. But FOMO only happens after the first few get on board. The biggest inertia hurdle of any systems transformation is a term coined by Ashby Monk during the renewable energy infrastructure transition. And it's FOMO, which is fear of messing up. So individual corporates that are pulling the buy side don't want to be alone in case they mess up in terms of picking the right choices. So this idea of collective action on the buy side or through the value chain allows for the dispersion of that fear of messing up risk. And I think will get us over some of this inertia hurdle as we get the initial stages where there's research, where there's some awareness, but we don't have a perfect solution. The imperfect can still move forward, but it needs to be done collectively and through a systems lens.
I think though what you're pointing to in part that's a really critical component is our consumers, where we feel other aspects are, whether it's negotiating a treaty, other things that are moving forward in its own track. And I don't know whether most consumers are there. And so part of launching a product is the piece that I talked about, which is the education piece. I think that's coming along naturally with public media and offering clear alternatives will meet that need. But I don't think it's a simple step. I think that it's a more complex thing that you talked about in terms of simple messaging. How do you get this out and make it attractive to people? And I think that will synergize, but it needs to be understood that I think consumers are just slightly behind, but I think the moment is right.
Fantastic. Keyvan, Audrey, I'm conscious of time. Do we have a moment to we have some questions on the side that I try to wrap into the conversation. If we have any hands, we can call on them, but I want to make sure that where we are on the time side. So Kayvon, Audrey, please over to you, and we can.
Time for one more question. Thank you, Harry. Kiara.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually kind of have, sorry, I'm going to sneak a little two-part question. I know you said one more, but I think the first piece is what similar to what you were just talking about. I mean, you mentioned just about businesses coming together to think about the possibility of sort of, how do we externalize this cost of the negative health benefits, or negative health impacts and other things that plastics are causing on our populations. And I'm curious, thinking as we're here for Impact for Breakfast, just how impact investors could maybe assist in bridging this gap between consumers' ability to access products at an accessible cost and the products that are coming out at a higher cost for people who might otherwise not be able to access them, which is true across the systems chain regarding sustainable products or plastic-free products. Even I know I've seen it a lot in the fashion industry, like linen products or other things that are within the circular system have much higher cost for consumers, whereas things that are very filled with plastics are harder to access. So a thought coming to me sitting here as a part of the impact investor ecosystem is just how could impact investors alongside business people maybe be a population that could come in and help kind of to get to the onset of those products hitting the public market more significantly, support in kind of capturing some of that externalized cost while, maybe measuring for impact over only just measuring for return. And my second part of the question, which maybe is a bigger one to just pose for future thought, is around how Indigenous populations might be able to provide sets of solutions to this problem regarding their experience and abilities to be present with our nature-based solutions, and kind of if there has been any partnerships with Indigenous populations to look at solutions to this systems problem.
Yeah, really interesting questions, both of them. I would say that, a lot of it comes down to a matter of risk and where to put money down, as you're saying. And I think that impact investors may be a little bit more willing to take on some risk. And I think that what we've tried to do is create a pathway to reduce risk across the board. So we think that the challenge of creating a successful product is always challenging, but I think it's very doable at the high end. And that's obviously not where we want it to be ultimately, but that's where we start because that's the easiest and low-hanging fruit to help fuel the real innovation. The real innovation is a low-cost liner that we think is achievable. So I think it's creating a sort of process or a sort of innovation pipeline, let's say, to be able to create the type of goods that are out there, both financially for the broader market, but also that's really doable. I mean, plastic is so cheap, which is one of the challenges. But I think it's eminently doable. There's so much potential innovation, say at least in the medical space, that can be harnessed to do that. We're working with different entities to try to see how we can advance this kind of thing. So the hope is you create this high-end thing, you use that to fuel the next generation. And so I think just starting with that next generation is a little bit riskier. So we think this is sort of more of a pipeline. In terms of Indigenous peoples, I think it's sort of indirect. I think that's sort of not as much directly, but I think it's a really interesting point. I think meaning that it's a matter of looking at what have people done in the past, what do people do now, there's a colleague we're working with who really looks at how do you harness what nature has evolved to utilize that, whether it's what insects do to grab onto something, whether it's what our bodies have evolved, how do you then harness that to turn that into a product to be successful? It's not quite what you're talking about, but it's sort of understanding how nature works to be able to harness those things to impact these problems.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. Then just very quickly, this is maybe an answer which will a question we can also answer on the previous and future sessions along that seaweed value chain, but that's specifically what we're working on as well in terms of building an investment or funding platform specifically to answer both of those questions, Chiara, which is how do you massively scale up the right types of seaweed strains so that the unit economic costs are low enough to enable that value chain to be attractive for industry to transition to? And the second part is that part of that massive scale up of seaweed, not just sargassum plugging it in, but whether it's Southeast Asia and the farmers and all the different types of seaweeds, which are having many other co-benefits, is directly linked to creating non-disturbing use of indigenous lands and people's approaches. So all of it doesn't sort of alter land use, but when it comes to indigenous populations on coastal areas, this is a massive, the implications that there would be requirements from a huge mobilization and improvements in how they are able to be scaled up to get there. So directly linked to your question, both questions is, I think that's pretty much what we're working on in terms of scaling the seaweed to plastics value chain.
Yeah, yeah. We're rounding out our time together. Declan, you mentioned making some impact connections with things like tobacco. Tobacco's a choice, right? You put a cigarette or a pipe to your lips, that's a choice. I made a choice to buy a higher end water bottle. I didn't realize that I'm also using a pepper mill for microplastics, right? The awareness piece is huge, right? There's a certification role. There's so many key components. That's why we're approaching this entire series from a systemic lens. What is the whole that needs to be created, right, to make this transition? And the good news is that we created this particular outcome, right? We did this. We're great at this. We're also got to be great at the transition. And this is what we're trying to do at Impact for Breakfast and other sessions very similar to this, is to make all those connections, coordinate all the pieces, structure the investments, and time them in a way where we can make this successful transition. So what we will do is within a few days, we will share the recording of this session. In the chat, you will see the link to the next session on two companies who are doing some amazing things, particularly with seaweeds and sargassum, and plugging those into different supply chains, agricultural inputs, emulsifiers, liners to products. So it is happening. We're just trying to generate more and more momentum for it because we just frankly need to. So we will follow up with a thank you note. In that thank you note, we'll also say very clearly, should you want to be connected with any of the panelists or co-facilitators, we're happy to make that connection. My email address is in the chat. Please reach out. We're happy to do this. This is why we're here. So given that we're out of time, any other questions that you might have, please feel free to forward them. We'll try to field those to the appropriate people. And with that, I want to just say thank you very much for joining us. And we look forward to your participation in sessions 3 and 4. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
And you, Josh, Alex, thank you.
Great. I enjoyed it. Thank you.